Welcome. You are watching episode 41 of Regional Wrap, pre-recorded on Friday the 18th of March for release on Wednesday the 23rd of March. Regional Wrap, providing an insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, the process IPC assessment reports, is my guest, Professor Lesley Hughes. Lesley is a distinguished Professor of Biology and Interim Executive Dean of the Faculty of Science and Engineering at Macquarie University. Her principal research interests have been in the impacts of climate change on species, ecosystems, and the implications for conservation. She is a former lead author of IPC's 4th and 5th assessment reports, a former Federal Climate Commissioner, a member of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists, and a founding councillor with the Climate Council of Australia. Welcome, Lesley.
Hi, Bill.
If we could just, I'd like to approach this in regards to, we've just had assessment report number 6 out. It came out early in about September last year, the first part of it, and I think Working Group 2's paper was only released a couple of weeks ago. In your experience with the assessment reports, maybe you can give us a little bit of information in regards to the content, the people involved, and also maybe the expectations of governments and the population in regards to the information there. But if I'll just start with flicking up a screen. So since 1988, that was when James Hansen testimony before Congress, and he was basically known as the father of and creating awareness of global warming. And the IPC was formed in 1988, and we've had those 6 scientific assessments from 1990 right through to 2021. So, and the assessments are broken up into a number of sections. We've got the summary to policymakers, which is a fairly brief part of it. Working Group 1, which is the scientific evaluation. Working Group 2, that's the impact of the change, and Working Group 3 is basically what you do and what we have to do, like mitigation and things like that. Would that be correct?
Yes, indeed. Each of the assessments has a similar structure with those 3 working groups, and the reports tend to come out several months apart, but they're staggered so that the science comes out first. Then Working Group 2, it actually impacts adaptation and vulnerability, the second working group, and then mitigation is the third one, and it generally comes out a few months after the second one.
So with the 3 different sections, there would have to be a different level of expertise to contribute. You contributed to 4 and 5. In what capacity and what area of the assessment report did you contribute to?
Yep. So I was in Working Group 2 which is the impacts, adaptation and vulnerability one for the 4th and 5th assessment report, and specifically I was a lead author in the Australasian chapter, so that's the chapter covering Australia and New Zealand. And within those chapters for both of those reports, I had carriage of the biodiversity sections because I'm an ecologist by background. But because there's generally sort of 8 authors on the chapter and we cover a great deal more than 8 topics, most of the lead authors also have to take carriage of other areas. So I tended to be in charge of the health sections, but also contributed quite a lot to adaptation. But I can tell you a little bit about how the author teams are put together, if that's useful.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So basically, each of the countries that are signatories to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and there's 195 odd of those countries, has an opportunity to nominate authors in various roles to an IPCC assessment. So the IPCC has a secretariat that comes under the auspices of the United Nations. And then when they're starting the preparation for their next assessment, they send a message to the governments to say, please nominate experts within your countries and send us their details. So the governments then send around a communique in various ways so that people can nominate. And there's a number of different roles that you can nominate for. So each of the chapters has two people in charge of it, and they're called convening lead authors. Then there's usually 6 lead authors, and then there's people that contribute sort of smaller sections called contributing authors, and they're additional experts. Then there's also a couple of what are called review editors, and they're in charge of making sure that when the reviews of the drafts are done, that the author team adequately answers and responds to those review comments, and that everything gets published. So they're the sort of major roles. And when you get the communique from the government, you can nominate to be one or many of those roles.
I suppose with the reviewers, one of the critical parts of their job would be compiling it and readability. And so it all slots together because when you've got so many people contributing, you've got a bit of information over here, a bit over here, and then you've got to put it together.
Yeah.
That's fine. But unless you put it in a compiled system that makes sense.
Yeah, there's a couple of different elements of that. So within each chapter, it's the 2 convening lead authors that are really in charge of getting the chapter together, making sure it conforms to the structure that's been already handed down and agreed by the IPCC. So there's already an agreed structure. They have to make sure that it's kept to the space limits, and that's the most challenging thing in something like this, because there's always so much information to synthesize that you rarely get enough space to do it. But then there's also an overarching secretariat that's employed by the IPCC, what's called the Technical Support Unit, and they're in charge of actually compiling the whole report.
The report, I suppose now that we're up to number 6, there's quite a bit of information for, and sort of we've done it before, so it's a lot easier to do again. So the people who follow now, they have a good template to work with. They've also know what's been discussed before. They know how to sort of contribute to that to either pick up more information or add to the point of each section that's been put in there. Do you see us how many more AR assessment reports do you think we're going to have? Because we're 6 in nearly 30 years. 7th is due in, I think they're about 7 years apart, roughly.
Yeah, about that. Yep.
Yeah, so we definitely will expect 7, but do you see us going 8, 9, 10?
Look, who knows? I mean, they do get easier in some ways and harder in others. They do get easier from the perspective that at each assessment, there's a fair number of people that have a history of doing them, so they kind of know what's involved. But it also gets harder from the perspective of the sheer volume of information. So, if you were an author on the first assessment, there would have been far less literature to read and synthesize than there is now. So in some ways it's got easier from the experience perspective, but in other ways it's got harder because of the sheer volume of literature that is continually being published on climate change, because that volume is accelerating. So as to whether there'll be more of the same, look, after each assessment, there is always a big discussion amongst the authors with the Secretariat about whether there's going to be the next one, will it have the same structure, etc., etc. And thus far, they've all had roughly the same structure. Of course, the IPCC also puts out special reports in intervening years. So there was a report a few years ago about which followed the Paris Climate Agreement, called the Special Report on 1.5 degrees, which specifically addressed what will happen at 1.5 and what will happen at 2, and what the difference between those two temperatures actually is in terms of impacts. So there are other reports like that, but the main assessments have stayed remarkably similar in structure, though within them the chapter headings from one assessment to another do change. So for example, one of the things that happened very much between the 4th and 5th assessment report was that the whole area of climate change adaptation had exploded. So instead of just having adaptation within some of the chapters, there were 3 standalone chapters on various aspects of adaptation. So the structures of the reports do respond to the changing knowledge, but the overall working group structures have stayed remarkably similar right throughout the process. Whether there'll be more, who knows?
Well, once the reports are compiled and published,
yes,
right, you've got to do something with them. So who's the drivers who for each nation, and that grabs the summary to policy makers and picks it up and goes running to the government and sort of shakes their cage? Who takes, say, working group 1, 2 and 3's information, and where do they go to rattle cages and make people take notice to get, because no point having a report and then nothing gets action. So there has to be a mechanism to drive action for those reports.
Look, there is, but there's no formal mechanism. It really depends on the governments. But I mean, one of the things the reports do is that, you know, once every few years, this incredible synthesis, and let me tell you, for example, with the 6th assessment report, the working group 1 report is over 1 million words. You know, it's and it synthesized over 14,000 papers and had something like 70,000 comments. So they're extraordinary compilations. There's no other compilation in history with so many people working towards creating a document as the IPCC report. So they're really quite unique from that perspective. As to how they get used, that's very variable. I think one of the major purposes is to raise awareness amongst the entire world about what we now know about climate change and about how it's affecting things, and also how the solutions area, the mitigation area, is progressing. But one of the sort of guiding lights of IPCC reports is that we are all very much under instruction that it cannot be policy prescriptive. It's policy informative, but not prescriptive. So they're about providing the information which should underpin good policy, synthesized by experts, but they're not, you will never find a sentence in them that says government X should do action Y. That's not what they're for. They're actually a handy synthesis of the absolutely most up-to-date science or other things to provide an underpinning of good policy if governments and other bodies, businesses, communities choose to use them. But you can lead horses to water, you can't make them drink, but we provide the water there.
But you had the assessment reports have had a fairly good run with support from the media over the years. We know that when the assessment report's done, there will be a number of articles in, because I can only speak for Australian media, of course, but between the television, radio and the print media, there's usually a good follow-up on, and also a good follow-up on individual sections or stories relating to the reports. So that's one sort of thing that carries the message, and being in the media obviously makes the politicians pick up, because they've got 20 people or so Well, the Prime Minister's probably got 20 people who read the paper and every bit of news, and the same with all the premiers and that. So in the media, it's obviously picked up by the politicians. And then there's normal sort of chat and noise, in the public sphere on the topics. So that gets it in place. So in regards to official bodies, like in Australia, we've got the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO. They're the two main bodies who have a reasonable amount of input into the topic and that. Do they take additional things on board and relate it out to their ministers and things like that who have an overview of? And also the role of, say, the Climate Council, that is then armed with that information and can sort of also make the contact through its mechanism networks out into the public and into the scientific sphere.
Yeah, look, it's a very two-way process. So if we talk about CSIRO, most IPCC reports would have at least a few CSIRO lead authors. So the CSIRO is both contributing to the reports, citing CSIRO reports, as well as then helping to publicise it when the assessment comes out. Similarly, with groups like the Climate Council, of which I'm a member, some of our reports are cited within the assessment, but we also, when the assessment comes out, produce, because they're so big and complicated, we also produce a sort of explainer documents, and as well as giving webinars and explanations. So for example, when the Working Group 1 report came out last August, we did a briefing for journalists and then a briefing for ministerial advisors about the essential messages of the report. And because it had a lot of publicity last year, I, for example, was still giving 3 or 4 webinars a week from August to almost Christmas about the IPCC findings for different groups. This year with the Working Group 2 report, in some ways it's been overshadowed a lot by the Ukraine-Russian situation and then by the flooding situation on the East Coast, which of course is related to climate change, but also saturated the news media. There hasn't been quite as much publicity about that. So it really often depends on what's going on. But really, the IPCC report is a two-way process. Experts are contributing to it, but also using it to help get the message out.
I suppose the other thing is too, because the government usually holds inquiries on one thing or another in a climate change with one, either on committee, a specific committee, or a Senate inquiry. It also affords the opportunity for organisations like Climate Council, CSIRO and the Met Bureau to contribute at that time. And I would presume, the IPCC reports would form part of that dialogue in that sort of questioning or interfacing with the government at that committee levels. Have you been, or has the Climate Council been involved in those sort of committee meetings?
Yes, look, I mean, there's lots of advisory committees around the place, and many of us have been on many of those. And having the IPCC report summary is just a really, most of us, in fact, virtually none of us would go out and read every single article that has been cited. And as I said before, that the volume of information about climate change in the peer-reviewed literature is just so enormous that no one person or group of people could possibly hope to synthesize all of it. So basically, what the IPCC does is, get a group of experts together, synthesize all of that stuff. It gets reviewed at least twice by other experts and by governments. And then it's compiled, and the reports are still very large, but each chapter is sort of manageable. So you can go to a chapter on Australasia, or you can go to a chapter on agriculture or on freshwater resources, et cetera, and be fairly confident that you've got pretty much the most up-to-date compilation of current knowledge on that topic.
I suppose the summary to policymakers is actually, I've read it, I mean, there've been a series of them, but would you say the general public should be able to read and interpret the summary to policymakers? Because I don't find it overly difficult to sort of comprehend.
Look,
when you get into working group 1,
yep.
There's some things you can read pretty well in general, but some get a little bit past the layman. So
look,
do you recommend that?
Yeah, look, if you don't have a background in this stuff, I think even the summary for policymakers, which is, you know, the authors do attempt to write it in as accessible language as possible, but they are still quite technical. And that's why, you know, the Climate Council and other groups will also put out sort of simplified versions to pull out the key messages for the lay reader. I don't know if there's many people in the general public that will actually, like you, go and read the entire summary for policymakers, because the working group one last year was still 100 pages long. So
yeah, but there's quite a few diagrams and pretty pictures. That's fine. But the other thing is, I don't think a lot of our politicians have any great intellect more than a lot of the general people in the public. So well, that's my general opinion. So if they could, this is the point: do they actually read it? But if they can read it, well, then a good portion of the population should be able to read it as well.
Sure. Look, I suspect that the average politician wouldn't be reading it. One would hope that if they have climate change advisors, that those climate change advisors would have a reasonable background and would be reading it and maybe producing their own summary for their politician. But the point is that those reports are there. You can dip into them when you need the information. You know, you don't have to read them from cover to cover, but they're there. You know, it's sort of like an encyclopedia of current climate change knowledge that you can use for whatever purpose you have.
I suppose the other thing with AR 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, the conference of parties that follows directly onto those usually is quite an intense or a COP that wants to accomplish something. Because we just had COP26 last year, so there's been 26 of them and only six reports. But there's definitely a connection between the ARs and the following COP in regards to emphasis on getting something done. It's like the Paris Agreement and go back to Kyoto and all those things. Do you think? I think COP26 was probably, because of COVID and other factors, it was somewhat distorted. Do you think, and working groups 2 hadn't even been done, work hadn't been done, do you think COP27 will be another sort of milestone event to try to get some fixtures in action going ahead?
Look, one would hope so. So COP26 in Glasgow was actually delayed by a year because of the pandemic. So it should have actually taken place the previous year. So 2020 was the only year since the COP started when there wasn't a meeting. COP27 is going to be in Egypt this coming November. So the focus at COP26 and subsequently was on the near-term targets, so the 2030 emissions reduction targets that countries are putting forward. So the Paris Climate Agreement, virtually all the countries that participated in that, so it was about 195 parties, put forward various sorts of targets for emissions reduction, and there was no set template of how those were articulated, but there were most countries put forward some sort of target. Within the Paris Climate Agreement is a requirement that every 5 years those targets get reviewed, and they must be ratcheted up if they're going to change. Like, you can't sort of say we're going to reduce 20% and then come back and say, oh, we're only going to reduce 15%. So you have to become more ambitious at least every 5 years. So at the COP in Glasgow, there was a huge emphasis on what are you going to do by 2030, because we now know from the science that it's what we do this decade that counts. To have any chance at all of staying below 2 degrees of warming, we have to reduce emissions at least by half before 2030. Now, the declaration that came out of Glasgow was seen as fairly significant on a number of aspects, but too weak on others. And one of the things included in that declaration is that countries have to come back to the next COP with more ambitious targets. So every country that signed up has committed to doing that. Unfortunately, the Australian government, despite being a signatory, this particular government has said, oh, but we're not changing our 2030 targets, which are actually some of the weakest in the world.
I suppose what gets us over to the conversation in regards to picking up the bones of the ARs and the COPs in regards to what they've achieved. And the real focus, if you strip everything back, it boils down to greenhouse gases.
Yep.
That's the whole basic scenario, and what we're addressing. What we have to address is greenhouse gases, and what we have to do is find ways to reduce those emissions and therefore reduce future impacts. So we've got a situation now. If I can just show up the history of CO2 emissions over the since recording it in Hawaii, so people get an idea where it's going, and then what the different implications are of the scenarios that we've got to sort of put in place to make sure we just try to keep pulling it back in some sort of way before 2021. And all the discussions do centre around what's the impact at 2100, or the turn of the century. Is that the end goal sort of thing? Is that the point that most people refer to? Is that turn of the century timescale?
Well, a lot of the targets are couched in a lot of the impacts are couched in terms of what will happen in the second half of this century, so post 2050. So, you know, the climate system is very large, and so there's a lot of inertia in the system, and that means that, you know, the climate we're experiencing now is as a result of the emissions that have been made over the last couple of decades, and what we're doing now will affect our climate 2 or 3 decades hence. One of the main messages from the Working Group 1 report was that it is this decade that's critical, and if we can sharply reduce emissions this decade, then it means that within a couple of decades, we should start seeing a levelling off of rising temperatures. So that's the critical thing. I think talking constantly about 2100 kind of reduces the sense of necessary urgency, because that seems so far away that it's easy for people to ignore. And that's why focusing on the near-term targets is so critical.
Okay, well, I'll just show that screen anyway. This is from February this year. We've got, starting way back, I think the first
1958 started.
1958 started. So it's gone from below 320. It's currently up to nearly 420. It's nearly 100 parts per million. But it's also very interesting in regards how it changes up and down within a year on the basis of the normal hemispheres, winter and summer situation. In the sort of spring, summer, there's a lot of growth and it absorbs a lot of carbon, and in the winter time, there's a there's harvesting and things like that. The plants are not growing, so that's a fairly sort of significant sort of change within a year, just based on the seasons. Southern Hemisphere is not as critical because we don't have the same land mass as the Northern Hemisphere. So, what sort of factors do you think's playing out as we go forward in the natural sort of fluctuations, and then what we're pumping in through fossil fuel emissions, agriculture, and transport?
Well, as you indicated, the zigzaggy bit, the up and down, is due to mainly due, in fact, to the fact that many trees in the Northern Hemisphere are deciduous. So when they lose their leaves in winter, they're not photosynthesizing, CO2 goes up. When they leaf out in the springtime and start photosynthesizing, a lot of that carbon dioxide is drawn into the plants and CO2 in the atmosphere goes down. So that's that bit. The fact, though, that the whole thing is going up like that, that's human activity. So the natural part is the zigzag, but the upward progression, that very steady progression, is human activity.
At the current rate, I think the rate for the last year is a bit over 2 parts per million. It does vary. When we're in the heights of COVID, it actually went down to about 1 part per million increase over the year. But it's usually been around that, just below 2, around about 2 parts per million. Going forward, even if Australia participates, and even a lot of the Western countries, if we don't get something done about China and maybe India, it's going to be hard to curtail that rate of change over the next, say, 10, 20 years. Is how much of worry that, and how much influence can we sort of put on China and India to sort of step up?
Yes, well, China's the single largest emitter. They emit about 30% of global greenhouse gases. That means the rest of the world is responsible for 70%. They are aiming to peak their greenhouse gases this decade, and they have put a net zero target in for 2060, but they say they're going to work very hard to reach net zero much earlier than that. India significantly has only recently also put in a net zero target for 2070, which is better than not having one at all, but it's still way too late. So, you know, those two countries have a long way to go before they are part of the global reduction. But I think it's also a mistake to sort of say, well, Australia can't do much because until China does something. I mean, the fact is we have contributed a lot already, and Australia is the world's largest single exporter of fossil fuels when you add our coal and our gas together. We are not burning very much at home by comparison, but we are supplying those fossil fuels to the world, and when those are burnt, they're called Scope 3 emissions. So, you know, it's absolutely misleading by some of our politicians to say, well, Australia is such a small player in this, what we do doesn't matter. That's absolutely not true. What we do does matter, because we're shipping out coal and gas to the rest of the world to burn. And also the fact is we should actually be leading the way, not lagging behind. And the Climate Council put out a report just before the Glasgow COP where we ranked all the wealthiest countries in the world in terms of emissions and in terms of climate policy. And we ranked Australia last on both of those rankings.
But moving forward, we also have those third world countries and other development countries. They want to lift their people out of poverty and things like that. So that's got to be another challenge that needs to be looked at. Especially a lot of those countries do have a high fertility rate, so their population is increasing fairly largely. Although you must have to take comfort from the developed world in regards to our fertility rate is plummeting and depopulation is quite on the books for us. And as the biggest sort of people with a footprint, our population's decreasing, we'll also decrease our footprint. But in regards to developing countries, how do we make sure they aren't victims of the enthusiasm of Western nations going forward to cut emissions and leaving them stranded where they are?
Look, it's a really good question. I mean, in 2006, Sir Nicholas Stern in the UK put out the Stern Report, and he described, which was on the economics of climate change, and he described climate change as the greatest market failure of all time, because the people that are contributing the least to the problem are being affected the most. So not only do people in the developing world contribute less to the problem, that's where the impacts are most difficult. They're often more exposed and of course have less capacity to adapt. So, you know, climate change is actually climate injustice. The challenge, though, of the developed world and wealthy countries like Australia that have great scientists and technological innovation is to help the developing world get pulled out of poverty, get energy supply and food security and water security without making all the same fossil fuel mistakes that we did. So, and that's why, you know, one of the big focuses of discussion at Glasgow was about this so-called Green Climate Fund, which is basically a fund of money from the wealthy countries to help poorer countries both adapt to the impacts of climate change as well as transition their energy systems rapidly to renewable energy. So that's where Australia should be leading. We should be leading the help, the aid to the developing world so that they don't make all the same mistakes that we did.
I think one of the problems with the developing world is, but with renewables and that, they get renewables, but they can become completely dependent on supply from overseas supply rather than being able to build their own sort of power requirements or energy requirements. So that still leaves a lot of these developing countries at the mercy of first world countries for the supply stuff, and it doesn't allow them to sort of make good on what they can do internally.
Well, look, the great thing about renewable energy is that unlike fossil fuels, you can both produce it and consume it locally. You know, those developing countries are much more subject and hostage to fossil fuel exports from other places than they are to renewable technology. So virtually anywhere in the world can produce energy from wind and solar if given enough help to get the infrastructure set up and enough help to get the appropriate grid set up. So there are, with renewable energy, those countries will be far less hostage to the developed world for their energy supply, but we do have to give them a hand to get that infrastructure in place.
Oh, I think that's probably what I mean. They obviously got sun and wind, but it's the hardware that goes with it and where it comes from. Even Australia, we don't actually build any quantity of solar panels. We don't make wind turbines. Everything comes in, and it's basically money going out. Like we don't even produce the steel pylons that the turbines fit in. So even for
in fact, BlueScope Steel is now doing that. So, you know, they've just started to produce wind turbines here, just, you know, in the last little while. I mean, we do have enormous opportunities that we are not realising yet. So we have enormous opportunities to harness. We're one of the windiest and sunniest countries in the world. If there was sufficient policy support for a renewable energy industry and then a manufacturing industry powered by renewable energy, we would be building all of those things at home. So that is the hope for the future.
Well, obviously wind and solar have got a long way to go because to replace the baseload power will take a lot of wind and solar power. But at the moment, in Cairns, we have we've got one wind farm in place, one currently being built, and another one on the drawing board. And the second one that's currently being built, the specially designed ships that bring the blades and the pylons on have deliver it, but all of that stuff comes from overseas. So I don't know when it's going to actually change, when we're getting more components from Australian manufacturers. I mean, that being self-sufficient and self-reliant and resilient is a critical part of the whole operation of your security.
Look, it is, and I think, you know, this current war in Ukraine is focusing attention on that. You know, it's obvious that Russian supplies of gas in particular are critical at the moment for energy supplies in Europe. You know, this is essentially a war of energy as much as anything. I think it's really focusing attention much more within the world about the desirability of being able to produce your energy at home, because then you're not subject to externalities like a war or other sorts of conflict. So, you know, we do have a fair way to go still in Australia, but, you know, in South Australia, for example, that really got into renewable energy before really any of the other states except for Tasmania, who uses hydro. There have been several instances now of a day when Australia has produced more than 100% of its energy needs from renewable energy. So we are getting there. And if we had the right policy settings at the federal level, as well as state levels, and the state governments are doing quite a lot, especially some like New South Wales, for example, we could get there a lot faster.
I suppose the other thing this factor is with, like I say, the current installation of wind farms and solar at the moment can, on a day, have full power, satisfy all power requirements. But then there's days where it's, you know, 2 or 3%. So we have to fix that whole system up in regards to make sure power's there when we want it. So we've got to put more facilities in, more storage. So that's a part of that equation.
But the thing is, we have that technology. We have the technology. The battery storage technology is there. We've just got to build it. So, you know, a couple of years ago, I took a Climate Council group of supporters to South Australia to look at a whole bunch of wind farms and solar farms, and we went to what was then the world's largest battery in South Australia. And the thing that struck me the most was it actually wasn't all that big. You know, it was in a paddock surrounded by sheep, didn't take up much space, and it was the world's largest one. So we've certainly got the space, we've certainly got the technology, we've got the rare earths in Australia. There should be nothing stopping us, really.
Well, that's Hornsdale, I think, in South Australia.
Yep.
But again, it also has a problem. You need a lot more batteries to keep you online for a lot longer if the wind doesn't blow. So yeah. So we've got to build a lot more, and we've got to and all those sort of problems. But if I can go back to the general discussion in regards to the AA reports, and just pick up on a few very important things that drive the conversation, I suppose. And that's the different scenarios for in regards to if we just do this, or we do this, or business as usual, and the impact. So I'll just flick up the screen. And go back. And these are the scenarios, representative concentration pathways, global warming scenarios for various changes of the total radiative forcing in watts per metre. So the Paris one was trying to keep the temperature to 1.5 degrees. Then at 4.5 watts increase in the trapping of heat, we'll get a 2 to 3 degrees rise. And if we sort of get everything under control by 2021, they expect it to be 6 watts additional heat per square metre. And of course, the business usual one is 8.5 watts per square metre. So they're the scenarios going ahead. So when we don't seem to be able to, or any possibility at the moment to getting that 1.5 with.
No,
That's
we'll
gone.
virtually be certain of going over 1.5 by 2030. And that's because of the emissions that are already in the atmosphere commit us to at least somewhere between 0.2 and 0.6 of a degree of warming on top of what we've had now, which is about 1.2 degrees. So very, very likely get to 1.5 by 2030 or maybe early 2030s. What we've got to work really hard to do is to keep temperatures to below 2 degrees, because that gets so much more dangerous.
That's got to be a challenge, because I think there's another one slotted in there. I think it's 3.4, and that keeps you to under 2. But the general one that's sort of looming is the 4.5, which will put us between 2 and 3 degrees, which is more the likely scenario, with China and India still adding to the greenhouse gases at the current rate. So do you think that's probably our best chance of success in that range, or do you think we can do better? And to do better, what do we have to do?
Yeah. Well, look, it's what we need to do. You know, as I said, it was very clear. It's very clear from the science, and this was talked about a lot at Glasgow, that if we are able to reduce our emissions by half or more than a half by 2030, we've got a reasonable chance of staying below 2 degrees. The pledges that the countries made to the Paris Climate Agreement, if kept 100% and on time, would get us to somewhere between 2.7 and 3 degrees. Many countries upped their level of ambition to go to Glasgow, and if those pledges are met 100% on time, we get to about 2.4 degrees. Now that's twice the warming that we've had so far. So that's still pretty dangerous, especially in a country like Australia. So that's why the ambition to peak emissions and start coming down the other side sometime this decade, with being definitely peaked by 2030, is absolutely critical for a safe planet in the second half of this century.
But even if we get to that peak, say we get to that peak in May, say for some miracle we get to it in 2040, for some reason we get to that peak and we're going down, we're still going to be adding to the parts per million of CO2. We can only sort of bring the level of CO2 down if actually we're extracting CO2 from the atmosphere. Do you think that will ever happen, or we're
Mm-hmm.
just stuck with CO2's got to increase, but we've got to sort of
this is why there's so much talk about net zero. Net zero means that the emissions are no longer going up, and then we've got to work hard to then extract more than we're putting in, so go into negatives to reduce emissions and therefore stabilise and then reduce temperature. There is a lot of research going into mechanisms, technologies, loosely called drawdown technologies, which is basically anything that sucks carbon out of the atmosphere and then holds it in some sort of safer form. So there are some machines now. One of them has just been deployed in Iceland as a pilot to basically suck CO2 out of the atmosphere and turn it into a liquid form and inject it into the earth. Of course, we need a few million of those to be effective, so it's really only a pilot technology at this stage. Of course, the best way to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere is to grow more trees, because that's what trees do. They photosynthesize, they take carbon dioxide out and they turn it into solid carbon, which is basically wood. So one of the things we do have to do is approach the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis as twin crises to be solved together, because they each exacerbate the other. And the more we can turn back the clock on land clearing, the more we can revegetate where we can, the easier it will be to bring that CO2 down.
As a biologist, and that obviously with photosynthesis and absorbing into trees and that, but just growing trees and continue to grow trees, forests and that, it becomes a neutral thing unless you're actually harvesting trees, putting the timber away and then growing new trees. But an old forest is, at best, carbon neutral, at worst, carbon positive, because trees fall over, they rot. If it's a damp environment, they'll produce methane, which is 20 times worse than CO2. And then the other thing that happens if you don't harvest timber and you just leave a forest out there, it eventually burns down and releases the CO2. So is there a bounce in regards to, well, we want to put more timber in the system, but what we want is new timber, new growth to suck the carbon out, because an old tree is not very efficient in sucking carbon out. It's basically had its growth spurt. It's very slow now. If we took that tree, harvested, and I don't care what you do, cut it up and put it down a old coal mine or something and store it down there, or you can be like, you go to Europe. If you go to Europe in sort of places like Munich and that, you can go to buildings that are 700 years old and still got the same pieces of timber supporting them. So we can do a lot with that timber. Do you see a bounce between just putting in more trees and harvesting old trees and putting in and new growth?
Yeah, look, it is absolutely the case that as the best carbon sequesters in terms of the rate of carbon sequestration is a young, fast-growing tree. And when they do get to maturity, the rate of extra carbon sequestered absolutely levels off. So you're right from that respect. I think we've just got to look at the whole carbon sequestration, carbon drawdown issue as there not being a single solution. You know, revegetating has other benefits as well in terms of biodiversity and other sorts of things. That's part of the solution. We cannot, however, offset. We've also got to just stop putting CO2 into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, because we cannot offset all of that using tree growth. So we've got to stop the source. That's the most critical thing. We've got to revegetate as much as we can. And then there's all sorts of other technologies. So, you know, there's technologies to reflect heat back out into space that are being experimented with now, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got to approach the climate change problem, which has come about through billions and billions of bad decisions, with billions and billions of better decisions and a multitude of solutions. And we have to employ all of those together.
Just touching there on reflecting the extra sunlight back into space, you'd still have to be concerned about some of the proposals in the geoscience thing of putting aerosols into space and all those sort of things, because you can't actually remove them very quickly. And there has been a conversation about doing those sort of things. Do you have a bit of an apprehension about some of the ideas that come up and may actually get a Guernsey?
Yes, look, geoengineering is a big unknown. You know, we're already doing a very dangerous experiment with the Earth system, and more dangerous experiments could just have unintended consequences. So, for example, one of the geoengineering techniques that's been trialled quite a bit is ocean fertilization, where iron filings are essentially scattered in the ocean. They stimulate phytoplankton growth because phytoplankton generally are iron limited. They photosynthesize a lot. That draws down carbon. When the phytoplankton dies, they go down to the depths and take that carbon with them. But there's all sorts of other ecosystem consequences of doing that. So there's probably no geoengineering that's been invented thus far that doesn't have worrying potential risks. So that's why relying on that drawdown technology in many cases is probably not a good idea. We're much better off focusing on stopping the cause of the problem and coming up with alternative forms of powering the planet than, you know, undertaking even more dangerous experiments.
I suppose the other thing is too, I mean, if CO2 is the real concern and people are adamant that that's the thing we've got to address, it seems to me the reluctance to go to nuclear power by certain elements of the people within climate change is a bit counterproductive. So it is nuclear power something that should be considered if we're simply talking about cutting back on CO2 emissions?
Look, it depends on where you are. So in those countries like in England and Europe that already have very significant nuclear infrastructure that's working pretty well, you know, they are using nuclear power to help get their CO2 emissions under control. It's a big part of their solution. For a country like Australia, where there isn't nuclear power producing energy, you basically would have to start from scratch. And that presents two problems. One is politically, where would you put it? There'd be no community in Australia, I suspect, that would want it in their backyard. So you've got a political problem, but you've also got a financial problem. I mean, a nuclear power station costs billions and billions of dollars, so you need the capital. They also take a long time to build. So you would have to, if you wanted to build a new nuclear power station from scratch, you would have to get a bank or other financial institution to lend you billions of dollars, and then you might not be able to be starting to pay that money back for 10 or 20 years. Now, given that renewable energy's costs are getting cheaper and cheaper all the time, I don't see that there'd be any financial institution that would lend the money, because by the time the nuclear power station came on board and was ready to start generating a profit and pay the loan back, renewables are just going to be so much cheaper that the nuclear power won't be competitive. So I think if you're a country like Australia that would be starting from scratch, nuclear is never going to be a practical option.
I think the last two reactors built in the United States, or currently building in the United States, show exactly what you're talking about as a classic example. The two reactors are in Georgia, and it wasn't even a greenfield site. There was already two reactors there. They looked at starting that project in 2009, got the approval, got around to starting them by 2016, but they were supposed to be finished by 2018. So that was the sort of lead time. And that was in part because the expertise that the US used to have in the 50s and 60s has dissipated. So there was a lot of problems in regards to the actual construction. And those two reactors now, I think they were expected to come in and be operational by 2018 for $9 billion. It's now 2022. Neither are online, and we're up to $30 billion. So if you imagine Australia building two reactors, and the way our projects come in on time and budget, it would be asking for a monumental disaster. But saying that, there is also new innovations with the nuclear power and that as we go forward.
Look, there are small reactors and you know, perhaps they're part of the way to go. But you know, the classic type of nuclear reactor, if we built it today, would be a classic stranded asset. I mean, we talk about coal mines and coal-fired power stations rapidly becoming stranded assets as well. Nuclear power would be absolutely in that category.
Yeah, those ones are definitely out. There would be madness to sort of even venture there. But it's like everything. If you wait for someone else to get something up and develop something, you can always look at it at a later date. But as a biologist, in regards to solar farms, and in particular wind farms. In Cairns, we have a very strong Greens movement. We have an element of Extinction Rebellion. We have a number of conservation societies. Now, when there was a test wind farm put up here some years ago, and as a result of that, there was a decision to go ahead with Emerald Wind Farm up on the tablelands. Now, the environmentalists here were all behind that, and there was no real opposition to it. No. However, now we're we're now building a second one up at Caban, again on the tablelands, and the third one is in Chilumban, which is a forest area that was basically saved from logging by environmentalists. Now, although it's not running full at the moment, there is a bit of momentum building up, and as resistance to wind farms in regards to people who are concerned about the actual tree environment, animal environment, and stuff like that. Do you see us going ahead, the amount of wind farms and that we're sort of looking at putting in, especially around state forest areas and things like that? Do you think there's going to be a bit of a pushback at some time as we go forward?
Yeah, look, I mean, there are concerns that wind farms, I mean, they do kill birds from time to time and other flying creatures. So they need to be sited very carefully, so you would not put a wind farm up in the path of a whole bunch of migratory birds, for example. That would be silly. There are always going to be costs of any technology, but I think we've got to also look at the benefits and balance those. I mean, the number of millions of species that will go extinct even this century because of climate change impacts on top of other stresses is considerable. So I think we've got to be balanced about the pluses and minuses of any technology. And frankly, I think the pluses of wind technology in terms of replacing fossil fuel are worth, even the odd bird getting sliced up, So I think we just have to be a bit realistic about this sort of thing.
Well, it's not just the odd bird. If you just look at California, they accept a death rate of over 4,000 bald eagles a year being sliced and diced. So it's not minor. But the thing that's concerning, or becoming more concerning up here, is actually the tracts of land required for a wind farm. If you get Chilumban is probably going to be a bit of a battleground in regards to, because you've got a forest that a lot of conservationists put a lot of effort into to stop the logging and that there, and it's reserved. And then all of a sudden, there's approval for a wind farm that just gets a tick in the box as far as environmental assistant survey from the state government, and it's just shoved straight around. There is no environmental assessment action by the Queensland government. It's simply, if it's a wind farm or solar farm, tick on the box, send it down to the federals to approve. And that probably irks a lot of the people who saved that forest.
Yeah, well, look, any major infrastructure like that does need to be assessed for its environmental impacts, whether it's renewable energy or any other infrastructure. And I think there are probably very good reasons why perhaps that's not the best location for a wind farm. But we also know that on farming land, renewable energy production is compatible with many forms of agriculture, especially livestock agriculture. I've seen plenty of sheep and cattle grazing quite happily beneath wind turbines. So, it depends on where you put these things as to how the costs and benefits are balanced.
I agree with that, and I think that's probably the thing that's probably going to come out as we move forward. This dependency to site wind farms as near as the grid as possible is a problem, and until such time we encourage or subsidise or whatever to allow the proponents of the wind farm to move it somewhere and then connect to the grid, because the transmission lines the further you away are from the existing transmission line, it's going to add to your cost exponentially. And now we've got, I think there's one of the biggest wind farms in Queensland being looked at is down near towards the Bundaberg way, and that's got a border on a lot of, and in some of the state forest, and that's a huge one. And I think that may be a battleground. So it will be interesting going forward in regards to the people who are conservationists and sort of supporting renewables. When the actual impact comes onto their backyard, it may be a different story.
Potentially, yep. None of these things are easy, but we have to explore all of them. Okay, then.
I think we've done the topics in regards to the ARs and that, especially the summary report. But I'd like you, if you could, maybe consider, or having someone else to talk about maybe the work of Working Group 1, the computer models and the things that are driving those, and how those scenarios are worked out in regards to the computer models and the scientific impact and the arguments that for and against climate change sort of thing. So if you could assist with that, maybe you...
Yeah, look, the best thing to do is to look at the list of lead authors on the Australasian or the regional chapter in Working Group 1. There's also on the IPCC website a list of authors, and you can search on all the ones from Australia. So that would be an easy way of locating the best people to talk about, sort of from the inside of Working Group 1.
Yeah, so I think that's very important. I think we've covered the process well, and people sort of having a bit of comprehension in regards to the initiation of it, the compiling, and then its use out there in the political and scientific domain, and also with bureaucrats and that. So moving forward, we can move on and maybe have a bit more debates on things like the actual science, and then of course then the mitigation and the things that we've got to put in, especially like have more of a conversation on wind farms and things, especially the wind impacts on local communities. Just is there anything you'd like to sum up on as we just wind up the show?
No, I think we've covered a lot of it.
If you just stay online for a second, I'll just introduce next week's show and just come back and thank you. If you enjoyed tonight's show, please like and subscribe to our Facebook channel and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Next week's episode is with Bob Gordon. Bob Gordon will talk about the timber industry in Australia and the way it's been wound back over the last 2 or 3 decades, and how important it is really to re-establish the timber industry in Australia, not only for jobs and that internally, but also relieve some of the pressure on overseas countries, third world countries in particular, that are involved in overlogging. We're a big country, we have large forest area, and we should be doing our share to contribute to the world's need for timber. So join me again next Wednesday.